The last step to our subscription form application is to set up the form itself and tie everything together so that when the user submits information, it's going to get saved to our database. In this movie, we're going to first look at how we can use Zend Framework's Form API to generate the form programmatically, and then we're going to tie it all together so the form submission is saved to our database. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and use the Zend tool to create a new form. So I'm at the command line interface, and I'm in my Explore Zend folder, which is in the htdocs directory of my MAMP installation. So I can go ahead and type zf create form, and I'm just going to call it index. Usually the form matches whatever the controller is that you're using or the method of the controller. In this case, it's index. So let's go ahead and create it. And if you go into the application directory now, you can see it's created a new folder, forms, and it's placed index.php inside of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy a form that I've already created into this form. You can see it's called application_form_index. So it's always whatever the name of your module is, which is application, form, and then whatever the name of your form is after that. And it extends Zend form. By extending Zend form, I have a number of methods available to me, including set method, so I can set the method of the form to post. And then add element is a really important method. This allows me to add all my form elements into my form. The majority of these are text inputs. So in order to add text inputs, all I need to do is pass for the first parameter text. The second parameter is going to be the name of the input itself. It's going to be the identifier. And we want to make sure that this matches with the corresponding field from our data model. So in this case, first underscore name, last underscore name, email, these all correspond to our data model. The next element is an array, and this array will take a number of different options. The key one that you'll probably always want to use is the label, because this will set the label for the form element. But there are some other options. If you look at the email address, you can see I set the label, but I also set the field to be required. I create a filter which will make sure to trim it so that there's no extra characters in it. And finally, I add a validator. You can add as many as you want. In this instance, I'm just adding a single one for email address that'll make sure that whatever the user enters, it's in the valid email address format. You can also use the add element to add other elements like checkboxes and radio buttons. You can see the way that it works is slightly different. On line 42, I'm adding a new element. When you do it this way, you essentially pass an object in, and the object is going to be some instance of a Zend form element. In this case, I'm using the multi-checkbox, and I'm calling it interests. I'm passing through all the multiple options that are available. I also do the same thing to add a radio button, so the user can select how many tours they've been on. You can add a text area. It's pretty much similar to adding a text input. Finally, I add a submit button, and you can set the label if you want to. The last thing I do is I add a hash element. This provides protection for me from cross-site hacks. So now that I've got my form all built, the next thing to do is to add it into my controller and into the view. So let's go ahead and go into the view itself. So I'm going to go into the index.php, and you can see this already has the old form in it. So let's go ahead and highlight that entire form, and let's just get rid of it. Since we're going to replace it with our existing form, we don't need it any longer. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use in a PHP block, I'm going to call a special function. In this case, I have a property called form that's going to be passed into me from the controller, and I'll show you how I do that in a second. And it will have a set action method. The action is going to determine where the form is going to be submitted to. In this case, I'm going to send it to this URL. So it's essentially going to submit to the current page. And then the next thing I need to do is simply echo the form itself, which will output it into my view. Since I removed the old form, I want to go into my old layout and get rid of things that related to that old form. Specifically, I had a couple JavaScripts up here on lines 6 and 7 that I can remove. Since it was built in Dreamweaver, they were using the Spry framework to create it. There's also a code block down at the bottom around line 50, and I can get rid of that as well. That's just going to prevent any JavaScript errors that might have occurred from having that additional scripting. The final thing that I need to do is add this element into the controller itself. So you can see in the index action, all I really need to do in here to output the form is set that property. So this view form equals form. And then I'm going to create that form object. And all it's going to be is a new instance of that form that I created. Application underscore form underscore index. So make sure you save everything. And let's go ahead and run it. So you can see here, I've got my design wrapped. I have all of my form elements laid out. It's not super pretty. There are a lot of ways you can use decorators and other elements inside of the Zend framework to make it look prettier, but I didn't want to make the form overly complicated. So there's our form. The last thing I need to do is make it so that when I submit it, it will enter the data into the database as well as provide any validation. So let's go back into our controller. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to get the request object. So we're going to set a new variable called request and set it equal to this get request. So now I have my request object, and then after my instantiation, but before I output the form, I'm going to add a little if block. And it's going to be a 2-layer if block. The first layer is going to check first. I'm going to use the request object. Say if request is post. In other words, if the form has been submitted, then execute what's in this code block. And then we'll do another test here and we'll say if form is valid, and then we'll pass our data request get post. So that checks for validity. And then once you've determined that, then we can use our model to save the data and to write it to the database. So application model, mail list, and then we'll say mapper. So we'll create an instance of our mapper object, which does all of the database interaction. And we simply call the save method. And we'll pass to it. In order to make sure that the mail list data is in there, we're going to pass to the constructor of our object form get values. So this will then get all the values from the form submission, put it into our data model, and that is what will then get saved to the database. Now, if you want to, optionally, you can use helpers to do other things, to include elements. You can also set variables. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and say this, and then underscore helper, and we're going to use the redirector helper. And this is going to redirect the user to the thanks method of our controller. And we could have that do whatever we want. So there's our basic form submission handling. So the last thing we need to do is go back to our form and test that it's working. So we can go ahead and fill it out. Drew. Now, if I don't put the correct email address in, right? So notice I'll just put Drew, but not @ or anything. It should determine that I've input that incorrectly and reload the form. And you can see it even puts a message right by that form field. It says Drew is not a valid email address in the basic format local part at hostname. So what I'll do is I'll type in drew@lynda.com, which I don't believe is an email address. It's certainly not mine. And we can submit it with a correct email address format. Now, what I suspect to get is an error page because it's going to go to an action that doesn't exist, which is thanks. But basically, it's all working. So we've implemented it all. So this is a Zend framework application in action. You can see there's a few more steps involved than writing a basic PHP application, but the result is a much more organized code base. The Zend framework does take a little getting used to. There are a lot of features, but there's also a lot of complexity getting started. At each point of the code we wrote in this application, there are tons of jumping off points that you can take to go into deeper complexity and add other features. The advantage is this framework is well used and there are a lot of tools available to you once you get past that initial learning curve.